President Biden gave a powerful speech Tuesday in Philly, and it was very interesting to hear him talk about voting rights, the attack on voting rights. And we heard him describe this as a 21st century Jim Crow. He also talked about the invisible attack on America, the big lie, the fact that so many Republicans, so many Trump supporters are still accusing Biden of stealing the election. Take a listen at what he had to say last night.
The 21st century Jim Crow assault is real. It's unrelenting. And we're going to challenge it vigorously. We must act and we will act. For our cause is just, our vision is clear, and our hearts are full. For we the people, for our democracy, for America itself, we must act.
I want to bring in Ben, Anthony, and Carl Mack on this. You know, I think it's very interesting that we've seen a pivot here, even amongst activists in the Black community. Al Sharpton announcing that the March on Washington this year will also center and prioritize messaging around voting rights. Do you think that Biden is correct in his analysis and calling this the 21st century Jim Crow?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we, again, looking at the historical pattern to do so, any attempt to make something harder for somebody to vote is part of the reasoning for voting rights act legislations in the first place. And so when we think of in some of these legislators and some of these bills that have been passed and those that are trying to be passed, attempting to be passed, remember that they're doing so without any evidence that there is any assault or any challenges with our voting system in the first place. And the second piece is that putting things in place or barriers in place that are known, right? One of the patterns that we see here is that semantically on the surface, I can't call it a poll tax. I can't call it a literacy test or anything like that. However, I know exactly what the pressure points are for stopping folks to vote. And let's be clear, the more people vote, the people who are at risk for voting the least, right? It's a lot of our elections are around turnout for Democrats and around suppression for Republicans. That has been our pattern, whether we want to say that on the surface or not.
Brother Mack?
I can't help but agree. In its simplest terms, Jim Crow laws were any laws that provided barriers to equality. Separate but equal, grandfather clause, literacy test, poll tax, all of those things that would prevent us, and by putting these artificial barriers in front of us, were of that nature. And so when you look at voting today, especially in light of Trump saying that the election was stolen, there were voting irregularities, voters frauds, without any proof of that, by the mere fact that you had such a turnout of people to vote and ultimately Biden won the election, now the Republicans are doing whatever they can to stymie that participation of the most fundamental rights in America. So for Biden to make such a strong statement, absolutely. But I think what is important is that when he makes a statement like that, he needs to give the examples and define exactly what they're doing and why it is unconstitutional, why it is prohibited to Black folks, so that folks are now who have that opportunity to vote can now understand exactly what the game is that the Republicans are doing, and then challenge all of those in court. So it's one thing to give the rhetoric of you understanding it. It's quite another when one can see the actions of you attacking their plan to ensure that those voting rights are protected.
Ben, I know we talk a lot about I was just going to say quick, I know we talk a lot about the conservative Democrats. Do you think that this strong statement is enough to get them to take action?
Oh, Georgia, you read my mind, because that's exactly what I was going to say. But I do want to double back to something Anthony said that you said, brother, because we can't call it a poll tax. We can't say it's a literacy test. but they know the exact pressure points necessary to stop people from voting. I think that is so critical because the sophistication of white supremacy has always been such that it can evolve and evolve like a virus, much like COVID-19, to the variant where we now have to compete with it on an entirely different, we have to get a new language to compete with it, because while we know it's not a literacy test, it is the exact same pressure point. To your question, to your point, Georgia, I'm looking at the fact that not once did Joe Biden say anything about the filibuster. Not once did Joe Biden mention Kirsten Sinema or Joe Manchin. Not once did he mention those things. And I got a problem with that. Now, it is the new Jim Crow, but I need Joe Biden to govern himself accordingly, because if we know that this is what the Republicans are doing, then why are we not doing what is necessary to make sure that we protect the most fundamental right in this country?
Absolutely. And I think that it's vital for our democracy. And while he scratched the surface of that sentiment, he really does need to touch on those lifelines that Republicans are holding on in order to obstruct people's right to vote. It's the bare minimum that Americans deserve, the right to vote. It is essential to our democracy, and it is what this nation is built on, and the fact that it has been intentionally attacked, voting rights, that is, over the last, I would say, even 10 years. They started unraveling laws that protected voting rights back in 2013. And I think to mitigate that, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act have been presented, but they've stalled out. And so I want to take a listen at this second soundbite from Biden, where he tries to go a little bit deeper, but we'll circle back and find out whether or not it's truly enough. Take a listen at this.
We're asking my Republican friends in Congress and states and cities and counties to stand up for God's sake and help prevent this concerted effort to undermine our election and the sacred right to vote. Have you no shame?
And so he's trying to call people out, but it feels very passive, and it feels like his efforts even are conservative.
George, Ben said something, when you mentioned COVID. Think about what happened, and I think this is the way that the Republicans attack it. I mean, if you're smart, you look at what was successful in voting. And so one of the things that came out that was, I think, very beneficial to voter turnout, especially within our community, is that when you had COVID, then there were instruments put in place to ensure that folks would still have access to the polls. So if you extended early voting, that was an example. Obviously, we saw a lot of mail-ins. We saw a lot of more polls that opened. So these very things, as a result of COVID, that ended up increasing the number of blacks and other minorities who voted. Those are the very issues that are now being attacked by Republicans, to be sure that we take away instruments that we saw resulted in early voting. And so I have to agree with you again. It's one thing to give the rhetoric of addressing this problem and recognizing this problem, but until you put absolute action behind it, it is simply that, rhetoric.
I got a cosign, Brother Mack. The modernity of the recent election is scary to folks who have relied on for so long the fact that other folks aren't voting. Participation goes up across the country, it is an alarm bell. Just looking at the voting numbers and looking at the voting population, we found that it is easier. We can make voting easier for folks. Yes. I mean, we've had more conversation about making voting a holiday. It's far from being past here, because anybody, and let's just be an objective here. Parties are going to make decisions that are going to garner and make things easier for their people to vote. This needs to be part of our remembrance of history, right? Turning out vote and getting your people to vote is the base was the early practice of our democracy as it grew. So that is an alarm bell for folks. And then this is the reaction. The second piece I want to put into here is you already start to see, to your point, Ms. Georgia, about the erosion of voting rights earlier. We see the Texas governor trying to make the case that we're actually doing things better. We're better than the president's own home state because, we do things that they don't allow, right? Completely passing over the fact that Vermont has a 70% voter rate, much higher than Texas. The problem is that Texas's rate for voting, particularly among Democrats, increased. All right, and so and we haven't even had the conversation about the gerrymander, which is getting lost in the mix as well, that both parties have done. So let's be clear, folks want to turn out the as many people to vote, and we have seen that it is absolutely possible to make voting easier for everybody across the country, right? Voter turnout for everybody increased. We had the largest voter turnout, and so it boggles the mind that we would want to put things in place to put a wet blanket on that, especially with no evidence of voter fraud or anything that threatens our election system.
And Georgia, if I could just really briefly add, your brother Anthony, you mentioned Texas, and last night Representative Jasmine Crockett, from a state representative from Texas, she was with us on Roland Martin, and she mentioned something that really stood out to me, and I think we want to bring this to bear in this conversation. She said that the Democrats in Texas specifically see exactly how committed Republicans are to ending democracy. And she is appealing to Joe Biden and the Biden administration to show that same kind of spirit in terms of what they're going to do to fight back against this new Jim Crow. Joe Biden.
Yeah, and I would even go a step further and really start to ask people, what is it going to take for people to recognize the severity of this issue? Because it seems like right now, most Americans are kind of sitting back and watching politicians fight about this. The reality of it is, if we don't get a solution in place by midterms in 2022, folks are going to be showing up to the ballot and realize, man, I don't have the right ID, or I missed this deadline that I didn't even know existed. And so I really hope that it doesn't get to a point on voting suppression where Americans don't really realize how this affects them until they actually get to the ballot. And then there's been measures put in place that now prevent them from actually being able to cast their ballot. Unfortunately, I feel like there are a lot of people who are not paying attention to the way that voting rights are being attacked. And that is literally what it's going to take for them to realize this impacts me as well. This impacts my ability to cast my vote. Do you think that folks have really assessed exactly how the attack on voting rights is going to trickle down and affect them in the midterms?
But Sister Georgia, I want to say this. I want you to stop and smell your roses right now. Because if we didn't talk about it, then that situation that you just described, that would be the case. So for you to bring this to On the Clock and us talk about it, that's going to put an awareness into our community. For people like Latasha Brown and so many others, the NAACP and the likes who are out there, Brother Galloway, for us to have this dialogue and constantly, as their game plan comes into effect, we constantly talk about it. That is what we're doing. And so I want you to smell your roses, and all those others who are out there staying diligent and understanding their game plan and talking about that game plan. That is how we're going to keep our community aware. So you are part of that solution. I just want to thank you for this level of conversation.
Thank you.
I think demographic, growth, and I actually mean that there's a Freudian there, but I think it's important to put onto the table that demographic growth is trending towards Democratic votes, and so this is also, again, there's a red light, a red alert going across a particular section of communities, and this is before we even talk about the imbalance of representation across the country. The vast majority of people across this country live in urban areas, and so when you look at the representative map versus the population map, we already have an imbalance that we can't even get to in our political system in terms of where power is represented and who gets to have a vote or a say when the majority is very clear in one area, let alone getting into talking about our electoral college. And so we have a lot of issues that are here. And what we're finding in research and what we're finding in terms of the conversations, at least especially the ones that I see around the clergy circles, right? Young folks who are coming in with a lot more knowledge of our political system and where the pitfalls are. And again, if votes trend that way, there's a problem if you are conservative in the United States in terms of the number of population, in terms of the representation of power, and in terms of what the knowledge is shifting to. That is on the radar. And so in that space, it makes absolute sense for me, if I have the ability to do so, to try to hamper the ability of other folks to stave off that trend.
I was going to do my best to be quiet, Sister Georgia, but brother, you have hit the essential question here, because at the end of the day, they are in trouble. And if you add on top of it the ignorance of COVID-19 and the fact that they, Brother Mack, how we said yesterday, the black community, if nobody else get vaccinated, let us get vaccinated, right? You combine the fact that demographics are not going their way, of course they're going to come out with their fangs out, ready to strip democracy away, because they know the future is not a white future. The future is an egalitarian society that does not reflect the will of just white Christian men, and they are losing their minds.
But, the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that bases are firmly established. There are people no matter what. The Republican base is established. The Democratic base is established. It is that independent vote that one has to go after. So when we had what we had over the last 4 years of just an absolute idiotic president who placed on Front Street his ideology about white supremacy, that did not appeal to that independent voter, which was key in swaying the election towards Biden. So part of what we always have to remember is that when they come out like that, and I think that one of the biggest things that is going to, and I pray God it continues to hurt them, is that the Republican Party has now truly become the party of Trump. And that's why you see all of his surrogates bantering that same type of hate, unpatriotic, undemocratic voice. And as long as they can continue to do that, and we continue to educate ourselves about what their game plan is and trying to suppress the vote, we have a very good opportunity to maintain democracy in this country in its simplest form for me.
Absolutely. And while we have a few minutes left, you guys, I want to pivot here. There was a judgment order that came out after Judge Cahill sentenced Derek Chauvin to 22 and a half years. Within this judgment order, there was a piece that the prosecution called out and asked for him to amend. And it was interesting because the prosecution wasn't asking the judge to give Chauvin more time. He was asking that the judge make a correction about how he classified trauma by the young people who witnessed George Floyd's murder. And so in Judge Cahill's order, he outlined that the children who witnessed the murder had not been traumatized. Ultimately, yes, had he have acknowledged that they had been traumatized, it could have led to an increased sentence, but he said that they had not, that they were giggling, and also saying that they had the free will to leave, that no one was explicitly holding them there and making them stay. And so AG Keith Ellison made a request to the courts a public request asking that he change that and say, you know what, if you know any trauma experts, then you absolutely know that these children were traumatized by what they saw. And so a lot of people were questioning, if the AG is not seeking an extended sentence, why would he want the judge to amend this court order? Why is it so important to change the record, right? And ultimately, we just learned Judge Cahill denied the AG's request to amend that. But we've been having a lot of conversation about why is it so important that, if it's not going to impact the sentencing, if the AG is not asking for more time here, what would be the significance in changing those court documents and accurately? Because we do know, ultimately, we know that not only were these children traumatized by witnessing the murder of George Floyd, the adults who witnessed it were traumatized. And if you ask me, I think that there was a global trauma that we all suffered. And that's why you saw the response that you saw after George Floyd was killed. But what would be the significance of updating these court documents?
Well, Georgia, first of all, I think it's important to, if I'm not mistaken in reading those reports, Judge Cahill didn't even refer to them as children. He referred to them as young women. And so there was a lot of eyebrows being raised because, again, here's the judicial system not looking at our children as children. In the case of Tamir Rice, he was a young 12-year-old boy, but when the report comes across, here's a young man playing with a gun or having a gun. So part of what gets that is first identify and understand that they are children. They're not young adults. They are children. So I think what is important here is, and I'm no expert in law, but there is something called precedence. And so now when all of a sudden you're beginning to say there is no trauma in these young adults, or now if you want to say children, that sets the precedent up. So what happens when a black child, I can remember a case in Mississippi when these young black men were accused of, these young black boys were accused of rape. And I got to believe they're like 12 or 13, but they threw the absolute book at them and sentenced them as though they were adults. And that is part of the narrative in this country, is that they do not see our children as children. They treat them as though they're adults. And so for Cahill to act as though there was no psychological impact, and you could not have stated it more eloquently. The whole world had a traumatic impact behind the death of George Floyd. And now to say that you can't recognize that in children is you're absolute blind. And I don't think you're ignorantly blind. You want to be blind.
You bring up the expert testimony. That I'm so glad you did help define and make clear precedents, right? Because that is part of the role of the shift and reform. Brian Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative is working hard to establish precedent that enshrines and allows the law and makes the law act in an equitable way, in ways that it has not been enforced the same. I mean, we have a right to a public defense, and in certain states in the country, your right to a public defense and a public defender does not come from an actual public defender that's hired. It comes from somebody who's vouchered in private practice and does not have the resources to do their own job. And so we have to establish precedent in order to enshrine practices and standards that states won't enshrine in their own laws. And so that's a part of it. But the other piece is this case relied so much on expert testimony and putting expert testimony in forward and saying we're going to rely on what these quote unquote experts say. And so for somebody to, for an attorney general to look at what's happening in the state and to have folks making decisions that is not based on expert testimony is just problematic for the system itself. So in addition to the precedent, you have to make sure that the integrity of our legal system in the state, is held intact. Otherwise, that causes you problems in so many other areas. Just doing the job of paying attention to our legal processes in the state of Minnesota, let alone what is to come in the future.
Georgia, real quick, could you help me understand something with this story? You're saying this request was made by Attorney General Keith Ellison?
Correct.
And the request was help me to, because I don't think I'm processing right. I just need to hear it one more time because so I need to make sure before I say anything.
During the sentencing, Judge Cahill had outlined that he wrote out his reasoning for the 22 and a half years in a judgment order. And so it was a pretty lengthy document. Within that document, he addressed the aggregating factors that were presented by the prosecution, asking for additional time, right? And one of those aggregating factors was the fact that children were present. They were saying that Chauvin should get additional time because not only did he murder George Floyd, but he did it in the presence of children, disregard for them. And so Judge Cahill responded to that and said part of the reasons why he didn't give Chauvin 40 years and only gave him 22 and a half, because 40 was the maximum, was because he didn't feel that those children had been traumatized by what they witnessed. He also said that they had the will to leave. And so Keith Ellison, and that's kind of what the question here is, like, why would Keith Ellison make this request to the judge? Why would he ask him to amend the document and saying that these children were absolutely traumatized? Because Keith Ellison explicitly said in his request to Judge Cahill, I don't want you to give him more time. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking for you to correct the record. And so Attorney Keith Ellison has spent his resources in asking that this document be updated to reflect what he feels is accurate, that these children were absolutely traumatized in witnessing the death of George Floyd.
Brother Keith Ellison, we need you to come to the table so that we can.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Because we saw this coming, and I didn't say it on the show because I know Brother Ellison, and we've spoken before, and I'm fond of him, so I've been withholding judgment here. But brother, this is what they do when you try to ask for leniency for people who can sit on our neck for 9 minutes. When you act, because previously Keith Ellison did not want Derek Chauvin to get the maximum sentence. So the judge acquiesced, Keith. He did what you asked him. You did not like the justification. But if you had not stepped and intervened, and I'm sorry, let me dial it back because we saw this coming.
Keep it ramped up.
This
is our frustration, man. Let me be clear. I remember my mother saw the videotape probably before I did. But when she called me, my mother was in tears behind this situation. And what she said is, Carl, I'm listening to a grown man call out for his mother. So to tell me that you want to show leniency for a system to say that you don't recognize the trauma in our children, this whole freaking country, the whole world was traumatized behind that. But again, that is the type of leniency that we see time and time again. And again, I'm going to keep going back to that Sister Richardson. Sha'Carri, I don't care what rule is broken. There is always discretion given, and white folk will get that discretion when white folks are in a position to administer the punishment. Throw the book at this fool and throw the book at the judge. And for the brother who says we're not asking for more time, to hell with that. I certainly don't share that opinion.
Well, and I think we're moving into a dangerous place as we wrap up here. I do want to point out that Keith Ellison outlined in his request the fact that it's very immoral to say that children have the will to leave, that those children could have left. Why should we create a society where we encourage people, especially young people, to not act on their human instinct? The human instinct, what we saw from more than 10 witnesses, the human instinct was to demand that Chauvin get his knee off his neck, to check his pulse. People were concerned for his life. That is the type of society we should be trying to foster. The dangerous thing I think about this judgment order is the fact that Cahill is saying, well, if you see someone getting murdered, you should just leave. Why should we encourage that? And I also think that we're limiting the power of the courts, and we're limiting justice. Because when you talk about restorative justice, if you could acknowledge that a murderer not only cost someone their life, but also inflicted trauma on others, if you acknowledge that, then you could begin to do some type of restoration around that. We know that there's victim advocate services. So why not put some resources in place to help people decompress the trauma that they've experienced and cope with it?
No, but Georgia, let me say it more black. When you see a white man killing a black man, you should just leave. But let that be any other situation. So yes, I'm interjecting race in it because it just absolutely makes no sense. And you said a mouthful that when you see a murder taking place, your instinct ought to be to leave. No. When you see a white man with his knee on the neck of a black man, maybe you ought to leave. But I'm interpreting his statement to be.
For full circle stance, one of the things that folks need to understand is in our system in Minnesota, the appointment of Cahill, the first appointment is appointed. But after that, judges of the circuit have to be elected. And so when you look down ballot, in 2027, Cahill has to come to his name has to be on the ballot to be reelected back to that position. So just to put a full circle case to it, for those changes to happen, for this to be on people's minds, this is also connected not just racially, but also to the voting rights conversation we were having in the beginning, because people do not understand that about our system here in Minnesota.
My man.
Absolutely. Well, you guys, we could continue.
I want to close with this, Georgia. In so many ways, I can remember when I saw Chauvin being placed in handcuffs and led out of the court. There was a sense of relief because finally we see something that we've not seen before. But as I'm sitting here and I'm listening, I'm also coming to realize that I'm changing right now, right as we're having this conversation. And I am of the opinion, I want all of my justice. I don't want part of it. And that's what I think we're talking about today, is that we should be satisfied that we got part of justice. No, fam. Yeah. We want all of it. All of it.
Absolutely. Well, powerful conversation here this morning. Thank you all. For those of you watching, stay around for more on the Benjamin Mixon Show.